These are the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone Mini Donut Skates, GHOSTGLIDES' latest skate release and their most exciting one in my opinion. For those of you who have watched the channel for a long time, you'll know I'm a massive fan of donut skates, specifically the X-Ray Obsidian and Obsidian Air donut skates, so much so that those skates have been my go-to skates ever since I covered them earlier this year. But while I love X-Ray donut skates and they perform great, they've always had a couple shortfalls in terms of their sizing, as they're a little too wide to be used on some mice, and that their central dot with their sharp 90-degree edges were essentially useless. And every single time I've talked about an X-Ray donut skate, I've repeated the same criticisms, saying that they should be making the donut skate itself smaller to improve the skate's mouse compatibility, and that the central dot should be raised and rounded so it can be used as a proper micro dot or stabilizer. But sadly, X-Ray hasn't made any adjustments to their donut skate design, including their recently released Air series donut skates. So while the skates still perform fantastically, they still have the same shortfalls as the original X-Ray donut skates. But now GHOSTGLIDES appears to have done what X-Ray hasn't been able to do, as their new Cyclone mini donuts, at least on paper, seem to address every single criticism I've had of the X-Ray donut skates. But supposed fixes aside, the most important question in my opinion is whether GHOSTGLIDES' take on a donut skate can compete against the legendary performance of the X-Ray donut skates, and if so, do they perform well enough to match or dethrone the Obsidian and Obsidian Air donuts as my favorite skate of all time? I guess the title of this video kind of spoils that first question there a little bit, but there is a lot more than meets the eye here with the Cyclone mini donuts, and we're going to talk all about the pros and the cons of GHOSTGLIDES' first donut skate in today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you to Lethal Gaming Gear for sending the Cyclone mini donuts over for review and making this video possible, and without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. The Cyclone mini donuts retail for $20 Canadian or approximately $15 USD, the same pricing we've seen for the other GHOSTGLIDES skates. The skates come in the same envelope style packaging that we've seen used for GHOSTGLIDES' other skates, but the mini donuts packaging has been updated with a special pink coloring and a stylized donut themed GHOSTGLIDES logo. The packaging is quite the stark difference from the packaging we saw for the Vortex, 66 and Cyclone skates, but the new packaging better complements the whole donut skate theming in my opinion. Inside the packaging we have the mini donuts themselves, but unlike the X-Ray donut skates, which included 32 skates per set, the Cyclone mini donuts only come with 20 skates per set. Admittedly, I am a little disappointed to see this, seeing as the GHOSTGLIDE mini donuts are more expensive than both the normal and Air versions of X-Ray donut skates, and seeing less skates included for a higher price is disappointing to see, but pricing has always been a shortfall when it comes to GHOSTGLIDE products, specifically here in NA. In other regions, the skates will likely be more competitively priced, but since I'm here in NA, I'm looking at the pricing from an NA perspective. Also included with the mini donut skates is a single lone alcohol wipe and the same style info card that gives a quick description of the skate's performance profile and has a QR code on it that links to the GHOSTGLIDES Discord. But just like I said when I reviewed the other GHOSTGLIDES skates, I'd love to see the back of the info card, which is currently blank, have a more detailed installation guide rather than this little blip that's on the back of the packaging. Having a visual guide like the guide X-Ray includes on the back of their skates packaging on the back of this info card would be a significant improvement and would better explain how to properly install aftermarket skates such as donuts or dot skates to customers using aftermarket skates for the first time. In terms of installation, the Cyclone mini donuts use a process similar to what you'd use to install other donut skates. However, due to their mini sizing and unique central dot, their placement methodology is slightly different from other donut skates we've covered here on the channel before. Firstly, central dot on the mini donuts is raised and rounded, unlike the shorter, flatter central dots we found on X-Ray donut skates. The height of this central mini dot is the same height as the outer donut skate, so if you leave the central dot inside, this dot will slightly increase the overall control of the skate. The increase in control is very slight and is only really noticeable on very controlled fabric pads, but even with the central dot installed, larger donut skates like the X-Ray donuts are still more controlled overall, but I wanted to mention this as this taller central dot is unique to the Cyclone mini donuts. So if you want slightly more control on some pad types, you can leave the mini dot installed, or you can remove them or use them as a mini stabilizer dot if needed on some wider mice, but the usage of the central dot is mainly up to personal preference. Personally speaking, I just opted to remove them. Alright, now to install the mini donuts, first thing you have to do is remove your mouse's current skates. Be sure to remove both layers if your mouse's stock skates happen to be a dual layered skate. Next, use the included alcohol wipe to remove any adhesive left behind by the old skates. Let the alcohol evaporate off, and then you can go ahead and install your mini donut skates. Now, because the mini donuts are larger than dot skates, keep in mind that they'll be much more controlled than dots will be, so you don't need to use as many donut skates as you would have dots to get a specific level of control. My general rule of thumb is that one mini donut is equivalent to roughly 3 dot skates, so keep that in mind when you're installing it on your mouse. As such, on smaller mice I generally recommend only using 4 donut skates, and on larger mice you can use anywhere from 6 to 8, but again this is completely up to personal preference as these ranges are what works best for me personally, but regardless of how many donut skates you end up using, just make sure to position the skates evenly and make sure you use the same number of skates on both the top and the bottom of your mouse. In terms of skate dimensions, due to their mini naming, it won't be particularly surprising that the Cyclone mini donuts are sized quite differently from the other donut skates available on the market. Comparing them to the X-Ray Pad donut skates, which measure 9.5mm by 0.8mm with a 4.3 by 0.8mm central dot, the Cyclone mini donuts measure 8 by 0.85mm with a 3.6 by 0.85mm central dot. So the mini naming just means that the Cyclone mini donut's outer skate is 1.5mm smaller than X-Ray Pad's outer skate, and that the central dot is 0.7mm smaller than the central dot skate on X-Ray Pad's donut skates. But interestingly, despite the mini naming, the Cyclone donuts are 0.05mm taller than X-Ray Pad donuts, which I thought was kind of odd. So because of the mini donuts' overall mini shape, combined with their slightly taller height, the skates are significantly better in terms of mouse compatibility than the X-Ray Pad donuts were, but I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. In terms of skate material, just like the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone dots and the X-Ray Pad Obsidian series skates, the mini donuts are made out of hardened PTFE. We've covered this material already several times here on the channel, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I wanted to highlight 3 major advantages that hardened PTFE has over non-hardened PTFE. Firstly, hardened PTFE has a much higher friction coefficient than non-hardened PTFE, so the mini donuts will feel more controlled than donuts made out of non-hardened PTFE, like the X-Ray Pad Jade donuts for example. Secondly, hardened PTFE is also more resistant to wear and tear than non-hardened PTFE is, so these skates will have a much longer lifespan than normal 100% PTFE skates, especially when they're used on hard pads like glass or ceramic. And thirdly, even though that the mini donuts PTFE is hardened, the material still maintains its hydrophobic nature, so the mini donuts performance will be consistent in both dry and high humidity environments. A fourth note I guess you could say I wanted to make about the mini donuts material is that since it's made out of hardened PTFE, just like all the other hardened PTFE skates we've covered on the channel before, the mini donuts will have a work-in period. But this work-in period only applies to when the mini donuts are used on hard pads, it doesn't apply to their soft pad usage. Now just like we've done with other hardened PTFE skates, the best way to work in the mini donuts is to use the same process we used for the Cyclone dots, which is to make large figure 8 motions with your mouse on your preferred hard pad while pressing firmly down for approximately 20 seconds. This process will fully break in the skates, causing their friction coefficient to slightly increase, giving the skates even more control. Alternatively, you can just use the skates and let them work in over time, but this will cause the skates' performance to be slightly inconsistent as the skates slowly work in. Because of this, as I advise for all skate materials that have a work-in period, it's always best to manually work in the skates so they perform consistently rather than letting them slowly work in by themselves. Now in terms of shaping, as I said a few minutes ago, the mini donuts measure 8 by 0.85mm with a 3.6 by 0.85mm central dot, and they are 1.5mm thinner and 0.05mm taller than X-Ray Pad's donut skates. Now the mini donuts are obviously donut shaped, having a thicker outer ring and a smaller central dot skate, but due to their smaller size, the surface area on the outer ring is smaller than the surface area on the larger X-Ray Pad donuts. Another big difference here in the mini donuts is the central dot, which I mentioned earlier. While only measuring 3.6 by 0.85mm, it's not only the same height as the mini donut skate itself, it's also rounded at its top. So unlike the short flattened central dots we saw included with the X-Ray Pad donut skate, you can use the mini donut central dot skate as micro dots or stabilizers on both glass and fabric pads, or as I mentioned earlier, you can leave the central dot inside the mini donut skate to give the skate slightly more surface area and slightly more control. This is arguably the biggest improvement here on the Cyclone mini donuts, aside from their smaller size of course, as the central dots we've seen included with other donut skates are essentially useless, so I'm very happy to see that GHOSTGLIDES has made the mini donut central dot skate functional and not just be wasted material. Now not only does the smaller sizing give the mini donuts a variety of improvements in terms of performance, it also improves the mouse's skate compatibility significantly. Since the mini mini donuts are 1.5 millimeters smaller than X-ray pad donuts, I was able to use them on pretty much every single mouse in my collection, including mice where the X-ray pad donuts weren't compatible with, such as the Pulsar X2 V2. Of course, there were a couple exceptions to this, as the mini donuts weren't usable on some mice with super thin skate cutouts, but overall the mini donut skates were compatible with more mice than the larger X-ray pad donuts, but they're still not as universally compatible as dot skates are, which is to be expected. Additionally, the 0.85mm height does make the mini donuts more compatible with mice with deeper skate cutouts, but you will still have some issues on mice with very deep skate cutouts, like the ones you'd find on Logitech mice. But for the most part, the taller height will prevent any height-related compatibility issues on most mice. Now, in terms of pad compatibility, as we see with X-ray pad donut skates, which were usable on all fabric pads and hard pads, even though the mini donuts are smaller and ever so slightly taller, they have the exact same Mousepad compatibility. But interestingly enough, GHOSTGLIDES is actually advertising that the mini donuts are to be used on fabric pads, not hard pads, as they actually recommend using the Cyclone dots on hard pads instead, which I thought was kind of odd, seeing as they're donut skates, which are universally compatible with all pad types. So despite what GHOSTGLIDES is advertising here for the mini donuts, from my testing they are fully compatible with all fabric pads regardless of their firmness, and all hard pads, just like the X-ray pad donut skates. This is one of the many reasons why I love donut skates, as not only do they have amazing performance, they're fully compatible with all pad types. So I definitely think that GHOSTGLIDES should be advertising the mini donuts as usable on all pad types, not just for fabric pads, as the mini donuts have better performance on hard pads than the Cyclone dots do in my opinion. So I would love to see GHOSTGLIDES update the Cyclone mini donuts marketing to specify that these skates are usable on all hard pad types, not just fabric pads. Now that we've talked about the mini donuts materials, sizing, mousepad, and mouse compatibility, let's talk about their performance profile next. Since they're made out of hardened PTFE, the same material we saw in the Cyclone dots and the Obsidian donuts, as I mentioned earlier, the mini donuts will have a slightly different performance profile compared to other donut skates. As such, the mini donuts fall into the same control focus performance category as the Obsidian skates did in my opinion, as the mini donuts are ever so slightly faster than the Obsidian donuts, but still significantly more controlled than the Jade donuts, for example. Alright, well now that we've talked about the mini donuts performance profile, let's talk about their pad performance next. Firstly, we're going to talk about soft pads, and then we'll talk about hard pad performance. Now before I get into this, just keep in mind that the performance data I'm giving you here is based off of my personal experience using a specific amount of the donut skates. If you use less or more mini donuts or a different centimeter per 360, the skates will feel slightly different on the various pad types, so keep in mind as the mini donuts performance will slightly vary from setup to setup. Now for all of my testing here, I used 8 of the mini donuts on my Wiseowl OGM Pro V2 with the central dots removed, and I played at 40 centimeter per 360. Another thing to keep in mind is that due to their donut skate nature, just like the X-ray pad donut skates I've covered here on the channel before, they are usable on all kinds of soft pads regardless of their firmness. So unlike the Cyclone dots, which weren't usable on soft to medium firmness pads, the mini donuts are usable on those pad types as well as hard firmness pads, again keeping in line with their universal compatibility that we've seen on all other donut skate types. On speed pads such as the Infinity Mouse-Ruin, the mini donuts controlled performance profile gets significantly changed, as the pad speed optimized surfacing removes a lot of the control you'll feel from the skates on other pad types. As such, the mini donuts felt more balanced, borderline balanced speed in terms of their performance profile, as their initial dynamic and braking frictions were the lowest on this pad type out of all the other fabric pad types I tested, which made them ideal for not only dynamic and tracking aiming but also static and flicking aiming too. As such, the skates felt very universal in terms of their aim usage and performed consistently in all aim types across all the games I tested. On hybrid pads such as the Focus Ambition, the mini donuts controlled performance profile was the best suited for this pad type, as the mix of speed and control perfectly complemented the skate's performance profile. As such, the skates stayed true to their controlled performance profile, but they felt very balanced in terms of their usage on this pad type, as they had the same universal usability for dynamic tracking and static and flicking aiming. They were just more controlled due to the hybrid pad surfacing. As such, the mini donuts will feel and perform as universally and consistently as they did on speed pads, just with a slightly more controlled friction coefficient, making them still ideal for all aim types, just slightly more static optimized. And lastly, on controlled pads such as the Raven Mori V2, the Mini Donut's controlled performance profile was the most pronounced on this pad type, as the Mori V2's controlled surface heavily reduced the speed we saw these skates have on speed and hybrid pads. As such, their initial dynamic and braking frictions were the highest out of all the pads I tested, which made the skates feel best for static and flicking aiming, less so for tracking and dynamic aiming due to their increased initial and braking frictions. This means that on this pad type, the donuts will lose their universalness as they sacrifice their dynamic and tracking performance for their improved static and flicking performance, so on control pads the Mini Donuts felt best for static and flicking aiming, less so for tracking and dynamic aiming. And now we come to hard pads. Now as I mentioned earlier, while GHOSTGLIDES is advertising the Mini Donuts to be designed for fabric pads, not hard pads, just like all the other donut skates I've covered here on the channel before, the Mini Donuts perform amazingly on all hard pads. Now keep in mind that due to their larger surface area, the Mini Donuts will feel much more controlled than the Cyclone dots or other dot skates will, just like what we saw with the extra pad Obsidian dots and donut skates. But since hard pads have a much lower friction coefficient than most fabric pads, the controlled performance profile of the Mini Donuts will be altered to more of a balanced speed performance profile when they're used on hard pads, but this again will slightly vary depending on the hard pad type you use them on and how many Mini Donuts you use. From my testing, the Mini Donuts performed amazingly on all hard pad types. They feel very similar to how the Obsidian Donuts felt when they were used on hard pads as well, just slightly faster due to their smaller surface area. And combined with their balanced speed performance profile, the skates felt very universal, just as they did on speed optimized soft pads, being ideal for both dynamic and tracking aiming as well as static and flicking aiming. But while the Mini Donuts performed great, they do have one downside when used on hard pads, and that is their audio feedback. Compared against the extra pad Obsidian Air donuts, the Mini Donuts have a much higher level of audio feedback, having a similar level of audio feedback as the Obsidian Donuts did, since they also don't have an added layer of SMPF foam that the extra pad Air donuts have. Now this was to be expected, but admittedly this does hamper their usage compared to more hard pad optimized donuts. Hopefully we'll see GHOSTGLIDES add a layer of foam to the Cyclone dots and Mini Donuts in the future, but until then, if you want the quietest experience on hard pads, while the Mini Donuts do perform great, you're better off getting the extra pad Obsidian Air dots and donuts, as they'll be the quietest out of all the skates I've tested here on the channel when used on hard pads. And lastly, let's talk about skate reusability. Just like the other GHOSTGLIDES skates I've covered here on the channel before, the Mini Donuts are using the same adhesive type that we saw on the Cyclone, Vortex, and 66 skates. Over my testing, the adhesive has held up quite well, and even though I removed the skates between multiple mice, the adhesive has held up and I haven't had any issues with any of the skates falling off or shifting during my testing. Their reusability is also great too, but the central dot, if you leave it installed in the skate that is, often comes out when you remove them, so you will have to reinstall that into the central donut skate, but this is a pretty minimal issue overall. Alright, well in closing, overall I'm very impressed with the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone Mini Donut skates. GHOSTGLIDES must have taken some inspiration from my reviews of the X-Ray Pad donuts, as they've fixed pretty much every single issue I had with the X-Ray Pad donut skates while keeping a similar, albeit slightly faster performance profile, which I actually prefer in all honesty. And given that the X-Ray Pad donuts have been my main skate for almost a year now, seeing someone finally make a competitor that fixes all the issues I had with those skates is awesome to see. The only area where X-Ray Pad donut skates have an edge over the Mini Donuts in my opinion is their audio feedback on hard pads, as they have the Air versions with the SMPF foam layering, and value, seeing as you can get 32 X-Ray Pad donut skates for 14 Canadian dollars or 32 Air versions of their donut skates for 17 Canadian dollars. But in every other area, the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone Mini Donuts are just outright better than X-Ray Pad donuts and the other donut skate offerings on the market in my opinion. And because of this, the Mini Donuts have officially dethroned the X-Ray Pad Obsidian and Obsidian Air donut skates as my favorite skate of all time, but we'll have to see how long the Cyclone Mini Donuts can hold on to the crown, as I highly doubt X-Ray Pad will just sit back and not alter their donuts to compete with these new Mini Donuts, so we'll have to see what other competitors to the Cyclone Mini Donuts pop up in 2025, but that'll be a video for another time. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to Lethal Gaming Gear for sending over the Cyclone Mini Donuts for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, Mark World, and everyone else. Our channel members make what I do here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown Project possible, so thank you very much to all of our channel members for your continued support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Met Keys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders and help, of course, directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the GHOSTGLIDES Cyclone Mini Donuts, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.